So a very interesting thing has been going on between Ukraine and Poland, and that is the tension over allowing Poland to exhume those who were murdered by Ukrainian nationalists during the Second World War. It's a very, very interesting phenomena, given the fact that Poland has been such a huge supporter of the Ukrainians ever since the beginning of Russia's war with Ukraine in 2022. And I saw a story today, it was published by Cressy, and they talked about how recently Ukraine started to exhume the bodies of victims and those who fought in World War II. This would include people who fought for the Soviet Union, members of the NKVD. And Poland was upset by this because here is Ukraine exhuming the bodies of those who fought for the Soviet Union, but refusing to allow for the exhuming of those who were murdered by Ukrainian nationalists, those who were murdered in Volhynia, Lvov, East Galicia, those areas. Areas that were once a part of Poland, but are now a part of Ukraine. And it's really interesting because here is Poland, right? It's arguably the biggest supporter in Europe for the Ukrainians. And for years and years and years, the Ukrainians have been asking for the bodies of victims of Ukrainian nationalism to be unburied, to be exhumed. And the Ukrainians have been refusing for years to allow this. And it's like thousands of Polish people have volunteered to fight for the Ukrainians against the Russians. The Poles have provided a tremendous amount of aid and weapons. The Poles have absorbed more Ukrainian refugees than anyone else. And it's like, here is Poland just asking for the bodies of those who were murdered by Ukraine's Nazis to be exhumed. And Ukraine is still stubborn about this, not wanting to allow this. Why? Why? Well, because the victims were murdered by Ukraine's heroes. And if Ukraine exhumes the bodies of the victims of its historic heroes, well, that would be an acknowledgement of what happened. Now, the Ukrainians have their own argument for this. They have their own side of the story, so to speak. The Ukrainians say, well, there is this monument in a place in Poland called Mount Monastirs. Mount Monastery, I think that means. The forest of the monasteries. It was basically the site of a battle between Ukrainians and Soviets, specifically Ukrainians who were fighting for the UPA, or the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, which was a part of the OUN, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, who were just Nazi collaborators and mass murderers, people who committed massacres of Polish people, people who wiped out villages, people who were really just no good, and the NKVD, or really Soviet intelligence fighters. And there was a monument that was built on Mount Monastirs, and the monument was destroyed by some Polish Good Samaritans, really. But there was a monument, it was built there in dedication of those UPA fighters who fought against the NKVD. And back in 2020, Volodymyr Zelensky told the president of Poland, Mr. Andrzej Duda, that he wanted for the monument to be rebuilt. He wanted a new monument because they smashed the old monument, and it was just sitting there for years. And Zelensky wanted to make sure that Poland would rebuild that monument, and the Poles did. They rebuilt it, and they put a plaque, and on the plaque it said something like, "Here lies those who died, fighting against the Soviets, fighting against the NKVD." And then behind that was a smaller plaque that said something like, "Here lies the bodies of those Ukrainians of Polish ethnicity who also fought against the Soviets, who fought against the NKVD." And the Ukrainians weren't satisfied with this. They said, well, yeah, you did rebuild the monument, but you didn't mention the fact that the Ukrainians who fought the Soviets were members of the UPA, the Ukrainian Insurgent Army. And the Poles don't want to acknowledge that those who fought the Soviets were members of the UPA, because it was the members of the UPA who massacred Polish civilians, who wiped out villages, who committed atrocities. So the Poles are trying to balance their way on a line between recognizing that there were Ukrainian nationalists who fought the Soviets, and because the Poles and the Ukrainians are united on only really one thing, and that is hating Russia, they can acknowledge that. And on the other side, not wanting to acknowledge the fact that the Ukrainians who fought the Soviets also butchered the Poles. So the Poles, they want to, we'll acknowledge that Ukrainians did fight the Soviets, but we don't want to acknowledge the fact that they were members of the UPA because the UPA killed our people. And the Soviets did save the Poles from the reign of terror of the fascists, which would include the reign of terror of Ukrainian fascists. So the Poles, at the same time, don't like acknowledging the fact that they were saved by the Soviets. They hate this. And I remember doing a video about this a number of weeks ago. It was about a video that came out online showing on Polish television a Polish Jewish survivor of the Holocaust making a speech in front of a number of Polish political elites, proclaiming, without any sort of shame or without any sort of fear or hesitation, that it was the Soviets who saved his life. And this angered a bunch of people, obviously. So the Ukrainians are arguing, well, on the plaque that you put on this monument, on this new rebuilt monument, you didn't mention the UPA. So until you mention the UPA, we're not going to exhume any of the bodies of the Polish people who were murdered by Ukrainian nationalists. So this is what the Ukrainians are telling the Poles. Unless you acknowledge on the plaque that those who are buried at Mount Monastirs were UPA fighters, members of the OUN, we're not going to allow for the exhuming of the victims of Ukrainian nationalism. So basically what the Ukrainians are telling the Poles is, unless you recognize, unless you commemorate those who butchered and raped your people, we're not going to allow for those who were murdered by our historical heroes to have a proper burial. Which really goes to show that Ukraine hasn't really changed, has it? Because even when dealing with its biggest supporter in Europe, Poland, it still refuses to acknowledge that its historic heroes were evil. It still would not allow even for something as simple and honorable as a proper burial for those who were murdered by Ukrainian nationalists, because Poland doesn't want to commemorate the very paramilitary organization that murdered its people. And Poland went so far as to rebuild the monument. It's like okay, we rebuilt the monument, we put this new plaque up there, we recognize that Ukrainians fought and died fighting against the Soviets. We got it. Here it is. And Ukraine says, no. You have to put UPA on the plaque. You have to acknowledge the Ukrainian fascists who murdered your people. And that further reveals the sinister personality of Ukraine. Even when dealing with its biggest European supporter, Poland, it still will tell Poland, we're not going to unbury the bodies of the victims who were murdered by our heroes unless you acknowledge the very people who murdered and raped and butchered your people. Why? Because the people who murdered and raped and butchered your people are our heroes. It's sick, guys. It really is sick. Anyway, you guys just heard some theology. God bless.